Welcome, welcome, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Social Workers in Policy. We are here to explore non-traditional roles that allow social workers to elevate their impact to the systems level. I am your host, Melissa Winarowski, and fellow policy social worker. Throughout this channel, we want to take time to meet with social workers in a wide variety of non-traditional careers at the macro and policy level. This could be in academia, government, nonprofit, corporate, technology, philanthropy, and even more. As we'll find out today, entrepreneurship is on the table as well. We are here to illuminate the path for those who want to move their career to the systems level and are actively seeking to figure out what are your next steps and how are you going to get there. For today's episode, I'm going to introduce you to Sabrina Gillan. Sabrina is a social worker who started out in direct services and case management before even getting her master's degree. She then used graduate school as a launchpad to move her efforts to the policy level, primarily in disability rights and in the housing and advocacy spaces. She is now the founder and principal consultant at Recharge Strategy LLC, where she helps mission-driven organizations turn their policy goals into action. Sabrina's bio is in the show notes below if you want to read more. If you really want to stay connected, you can join my email list and get all updates and announcements directly to your inbox. And that link is also in the show notes below, or maybe in the comments if we couldn't get it linked there. In addition to this channel, we're planning on dropping some other exciting resources soon, so stick around and join us if you don't want to miss out. In the meantime, we'll jump right in and enjoy today's show with Sabrina Gillan. So welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'd love to start out by hearing a little bit about your journey in social work. Where did you come from and what are you doing right now?
Sure. So I started my social work journey doing some direct services work in the deaf community, and I kind of assumed I would go into clinical work from there. As I went through my MSW program, I realized clinical was not actually for me. God bless everyone who does it. I love it. But it just wasn't the track I wanted to continue on. So I actually took time away from my MSW program and did direct services. I did case management. Um, I did some direct assistance. And as I was doing that, I realized social work still is really where I want to be. I just was able to make the choice to go into George Mason at the time had a social change track. And it actually started as a social change program and only had macro programming in its beginning. And so I went back to get my MSW in social change and had a policy. I was really motivated by public policy and really excited about the idea that I could have an impact on, millions of people's lives by advocating for or against certain public policy. And so that was my first internship and moved right into policy and program director level positions. Um, Ended up becoming director of social services and public policy at the Salvation Army's national headquarters, which is really where I got my chops doing federal work. And then I moved to California for a couple of years and ended up doing some local, state level, county level work, as well as continuing the federal public policy work in housing and homelessness, before moving to Michigan, where I now have started my own consulting company, Recharge Strategy, as you can see. And there I am working with organizations on a coaching and development. I do some coaching and development work, as well as helping nonprofits figure out their strategy for public policy advocacy, and then helping them develop that strategy, implement that strategy, measure their successes, and do some training while I'm at it. So that is the long and short of it.
So one of the things that a lot of folks find difficult, even folks who actually did a policy track with social work, is that then once they graduate and get out of school, it seems like all the jobs are clinical. So how did you maintain that policy focus when you transitioned from grad school back out into the professional world?
It's a great question. One of the things that I always recommend for people is to join coalitions. even if you're working in a clinical role, if you are doing direct services, you can join a coalition that has to do with whatever your topic area is that you're working in. Um, and so for me, I thought that at the time of my internship, I was in a coalition called the Behavioral Health Working Group or something like that. It was a coalition about 100 organizations within behavioral health and schools. NASW was part of it. We had nursing associations that were part of it. And it was really to advance policy on the behavioral health side. And through those coalitions, and I continued to really focus on coalitions throughout the rest of my career. I made extremely important relationships by showing up. So it's one of the other things I say about internships is when you're an intern, you should try as much as you can to show up in those spaces in the most helpful, engaging ways possible, because then people are going to know your work that aren't just the people at your agency. So I was able to, someone would need a note taker. So I would take notes and, send those out at this coalition. And from there, I got a couple of job offers just from being in the coalition and being really active, a really active participant, even as the intern. So that's something that I think is really important to do. And so if you're in a direct services role in um, like a child and family one, there's a child and family coalition. Talk to people in your agency, see if you can go to those coalition meetings. And that really gets you to stay in the policy work, even if you are actively working in a clinical role. And then as you participate and as you engage in those coalitions, you're more likely to find out about jobs that maybe aren't posted yet. You'll at least also have those introductions already, and people will know that you're a capable individual for those jobs. So that's some of the ways that I think people can stay or get involved. Because there's like very low barrier to joining coalitions most of the time. And so I would say that's a big one. And also you can do some volunteer work with a cause that you really care about. Um, for a while when I was doing I was just doing like social services programming. I really missed the policy work. And so I had a family member with ALS. And so I joined a coalition from an organization called I Am ALS. And I would do their policy calls every week. And then I would do their virtual Hill visits. Or, I don't think I ever went with them, but I did virtual Hill visits with them. And so you can actively be engaging on that. And other people are coming in, seeing your skill set and willing to take a chance on you.
Once you had this experience, you participated in some of those coalitions. What were the first opportunities that came up, and how did you use that then to leverage continued momentum?
Yeah, for sure. So I was in this coalition and I was working in direct services for the Salvation Army in Washington, D.C. And so um, my internship, they created a position that I applied for and um, was able to get. I turned it down in the end. But so my internship was one, and then there were two other organizations within the coalition. One where I went through the formal interview process, and another one that was basically like, if you want a job, we'll give it to you. But at the same time, I was at the Salvation Army, as I said, and um, they had some really good benefit programs that were really valuable to me. And I was really hoping I could do some policy in that role. And they just so happened to have just created a policy department, a social services and public policy department at the national headquarters, which was across the street from where I lived. So very convenient. And I got an email saying, you should apply to one of these roles. And it was good because it mixed my program experience with my policy experience. I was able to bring my previous case management experience. I was like 2 seconds out of being a case manager. So I was able to bring my case management experience to Capitol Hill to talk about what is it actually like to be receiving or participating in a lot of these social services programs like Medicaid, like WIC, like SNAP. So that was the job I went with in the end. and was able to still stay a little bit program specific, but also be doing advocacy on Capitol Hill. So that was.
You mentioned you started out in more clinical case management roles, and you knew pretty early on, at least when you went back for grad school, that you wanted to work at the macro level. Was there a particular experience or particular moment that stood out to you that made you realize, hey, I really need to be involved at the policy level rather than at the individual level? That's where I want to build my career.
Yeah, so kind of a separate scenario that happened that really was like, oof, I need to be doing policy. I was a sign language interpreter. My undergrad's in sign language interpreting and psychology because I was working at the deaf school with kids with a bunch of behavioral challenges. And as I was interpreting for this gentleman who was in a voc rehab program, and the voc rehab um, job coach gave him absolutely terrible advice for some interview skills. And I was interpreting for an interview that he was doing. He didn't end up getting the job and was really upset with me, which is fair. Um, but I realized in that moment that the ADA, well, and I shouldn't say that moment, I had been thinking a lot about the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and then IDEA, Individual with Disabilities Education Act, when I was working in during undergrad, working as a sign language interpreter, working at the deaf school, and really thinking about how pitiful the ADA is in general, and how when we talk about accessibility, how many folks, number one, just like get away with like not having accessible businesses in particular, and how minimal the requirements of the ADA are, and how much people fight to not actually have to participate in those like abysmal requirements. So this was something that would just really get my goat all the time in undergrad. And then I started grad school as clinical, and then I was like, this isn't for me. I stopped going to Mason for a couple of years, went back to sign language interpreting while I was also looking for a direct services job, and just watching how terribly inaccessible our world is, and how our government completely believes that like if you're ADA compliant, then you obviously are like going to be accessible and welcoming to folks with disabilities. So disability policy is something that I'm really passionate about, that I really love doing and engaging with. So, so I was the chief strategic partnership officer at a um, statewide supportive housing agency in California. And so when it came to the policy advocacy work and working in the county at the county level, in coalitions, but also with the Department of Mental Health, with the Department of Health and Human Services, to make sure that the policies that are being written allowed the programs that we were conducting to be as successful as possible for those participants. That's always really the main goal. So, I made a whole housing strategy or a policy strategy that included increased housing, increased accessibility for housing, whether that's for people with disabilities, people with uh, serious mental illness, people who have low incomes, or just like folks who um, had like criminal justice histories. Like we were doing a lot around that. And then also that staff who worked in these programs would be able to thrive in their work. So I was doing a lot of work around staff pay and also pay equity as like a policy step, like for like from the policy perspective, not just within our organization, but for the whole county, for the whole city. Um, and then also like really boring things on contracting. But like if you don't have good contracts, then you can't pay your staff well, or your program participants can't have predictable services if the contract is written in a way that actually doesn't let you do your job well. And then, like I said, I was also overseeing like communications and how do we talk about people and how do we talk about program participants and how do we bring lived experience into these conversations without being exploitative or without, while maintaining extreme dignity in all the individuals whose stories we're telling. So that's something that I work a lot around as well, because I also need that kind of storytelling for public policy.
So, for social workers who may be looking at it, listening to this and saying, wow, that's all of these different aspects, everything from budgeting and contracts to communications to actual policy advocacy and writing policy. Where do you feel like you really were able to develop these skills? Did they come from your social work degree? Are they things that you've built along the way? And what would you say to folks who are just want to get started down this path? They come from a social work background and they feel like, that couldn't be me because I don't know how to do all that stuff, although I know how important it is and how interconnected it all is.
Yeah. So I'll start with the policy piece. And I used to do this presentation that I should revive at some point called Politicians Are People Too. It had a very like fancy title, but then it was just Politicians Are People Too. And what I mean by that is all of our social work skills are directly correlated to the work that I'm doing on Capitol Hill or at, state or county like local legislatures.
So
I have this process where, first of all, I have to figure out like who I want to talk to, right? So that does take some of that skill set that you learned in your social work program, which is very research oriented. Like, how do you figure out who's on a committee? What is a committee? How do I figure out who's on a committee? And how do I figure out who is going to have the most sway over this? Like, so that stuff is research oriented, right? You don't just know that intuitively. You have to do the research and learn, okay, if I have a policy on housing, which committees does that touch? And that's where you get yourself started. But from there, I literally have like essentially like a one pager that I create on folks, but it looks very similar to what an intake form would look like in your direct services. So it has, age, family, like what does their family look like? What's their religion? Where did they grow up? Where are they living? Right? So these are all like very common intake questions. And then I have another section where it's um, where have our issue areas overlapped where I can say thank you for doing that thing? Or have they actually engaged with my agency prior to, and I just don't know it. So like lots of, looking on social media to be like, did they go and see, a local, when I was at Salvation Army, did they go to a local Salvation Army? And I just don't know about it, which is very possible. So I would kind of really research that. And so then I have a one pager. So I'm all ready to talk to this person. And what I'm doing is I'm then going in and I'm doing relationship building. I am doing rapport building, which again, your first meeting with your clients is not, hopefully, is not all about like, let's get into the hardest and deepest things right now, right? You are getting to know them, you're asking them questions about themselves, you're figuring out what motivates them. Why are they here? What do they care about? And then you're using that information to be able to build out your treatment plan. Or in my case, what is my relationship building plan with this person? And then you're using motivational interviewing skills, which everyone like is always like, what? And I'm like, yes, because they want to get somewhere, right? Like if their goal is for people to go back to work, right? So and then I'm like, okay, so understanding their goal is for people to be working full-time jobs. Great. Maybe the way that they're trying to get there would actually prevent someone from having a full-time job. But you only know that if you've done the work before. If you have been in relationship and in community with people living in poverty who are subjected to these policies. And my job would always be to be like, okay, so let me tell you what it's actually like to go recertify for SNAP. Let me tell what it's actually like to go recertify for Medicaid because they're not in the everyday experience and they're not writing that part. That's the administration, Health and Human Services, they're going to write the protocols for it. They don't so the people who are writing the policies don't actually understand what the protocols end up being for the thing that they're trying to enact. And so my job was really like I said, so as a social worker, I'm using motivational interviewing. I am, trying to figure out like what's their thought process and what's their goal and how do I get them to that goal in a way that's less harmful, right? Um, and so those are like hardcore social work skills. And then you just need like your research skills, right? Like we all had to do research. We all understand stats. And so I always say like nobody cares without a story, but no one believes you without the stats. And so having your story and your statistics to help advocate. And those are all things that as social workers, we very naturally do. We are taught to do those right in school. And then there's stuff you just have to pick up along the way, like any job. My
How do you, even though a lot of those skills would be very transferable, where do you start looking for that first opportunity? How do
like
you,
you can actually apply to jobs on Capitol Hill. And when I was in I don't know if I was still in grad school or if it was when I had just gotten out of grad school. And a social worker had given a presentation who she worked for um, one of the committees that focused on healthcare. And she is a social worker, and she was like, I wish there were more social workers here because we don't know what this looks like on the ground. And so that to me was very affirming because I was very new. Like I said, I don't even know if I graduated yet at this point, but it was very affirming to me that like our perspective and voice is very important. And so you could apply. And there's also internships. So if you're looking for like a macro internship, there are internships on Capitol Hill, or at your state capital or locally in county government. I think that honestly, that's the easiest way to then like stay in policy is if you're able to get one of those internships because government is all about who you know. And that's also why like those coalitions are really important is because it's a lot about who you know. And is that good? No, because that's how it stays so insular. That's how it stays so privileged is because it's really, it can be challenging to get to make your way in. Um, but the other thing I say to folks all the time is like, your job when you are applying to a role that's, say, like a researcher role at a think tank or a like data impact role, if that's what you're looking for, folks on the outside do not understand how comprehensive MSW programs are. They, might think of the therapist side. They're obviously going to think of like human services work, but they don't realize that you have to take your research and your statistics classes and that there's multiple. It's not like you get like, it's not like one easy stats class and then you're done. Like CSWA does not allow that. You have to have multiple stats or research classes, right? Your research methods class. Your job when you are applying to those roles is to make that abundantly clear. So possibly that's on your actual resume where you add your key classes. Like I've done that before. If it's like research heavy and people would look at my resume and be like, you have never done research. I would be very clear about what classes I took that did that. If I did a research project, um, put a research project. But it's really your job in your cover letter. I know people can't stand cover letters nowadays, but like it's your job to explain to that potential employer why your experience is pertinent and related to the work that you're applying to. So making sure they understand, again, those research skills, making sure they understand that, you did an entire policy portfolio in your program and this was the outcome of that portfolio, whatever the thing is, but you have to make it explicit, even if that means that you were actually like, so say you're working in homeless services and you end up having to do like a ton of HMIS data and you have to do the data analysis. Make sure you tell people that you have to do that, like you are skilled at that data analysis and you are able to, identify one marker that either like would make or break the clients that were coming into your program. So that those are the things that like are really incumbent upon the person who's applying for these jobs to make very explicit and clear to the people who they're applying to. Again, they're not going to say social worker and they're most likely not going to say MSW. Sometimes there'll be something like a human services degree or it'll say something like psychology or whatever. Um, but it doesn't necessarily matter. I think even as someone who does hiring, I always say like I'm more interested in the fact that you were able to do a program, whether that's master's level or not, than necessarily what your master's is in or what your bachelor's is in. for me, I'm just like, did you have the skill set and and again, this does not mean that degrees are the only ways to go about this, and that undegreed professionals cannot be really successful in roles. I actually had that in my last job. My policy director, I was like, I am not like, usually that would be like master's level, blah 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 blah. That man had more connections and more lived experience than anybody could ever muster, and is like unbelievably resilient and so charismatic and good at what he did that I was like, we don't need a degree requirement here. That's unnecessary. Like,
What about professionals who have been in the social work field for a while? Maybe they've been case managers or been in a clinical role and they're looking to transition to policy. Folks usually don't want to go back to the entry level, right? They want to keep their
right.
careers moving forward. So is that kind of pivot possible later on in the career and how?
Yeah, I think it is, but I think you need the right type of like you need to be trying to go to the right type of organization.
Folks,
I always say that it's easier to stay within your realm of experience, even if you don't want to do that in the long term. So, what I mean by that is if you have been in housing or homelessness program, um, and you've been doing that, working with that population for 10 years. Look at the policy and advocacy organizations at the national and local and state level that are in that issue area and start reaching out to them to have conversations. Get to know them. So it's not like I'm doing that right now with my work because I just moved to Michigan. I don't know the ecosystem as well, and I don't think I'm going to be as helpful if I don't know the people and the ecosystem as well as I need to. So I have just been doing informational calls with every housing organization I can find in the state of Michigan. And this like NASW was like one of my first, areas of outreach so that they know I exist. They know the work that I've done. And, you can in those moments share like, I'm really interested in moving to more of a policy role. Do you have anything coming up? Or, do you know anyone that is looking for folks? If people know you personally, then you're a lot less anonymous than your resume alone or your resume and cover letter. Um, building those relationships, like even if that's not the work you're doing, because the other thing is you could be helpful for them. So if you are on the phone, so again, let's just use this housing example. You're a team lead for a housing agency and you want to move into policy. Call the person who is, again, we'll just use the National Low Income Housing Coalition, NLIHC, call their state rep and say, hey, I am doing this work. Can I be helpful? And they'll be like, yeah. Do you have a client who, like, I just got this, news request. Do you have a client who? And then you'll say, yeah, here's a story that I can give you. Or let me talk to my agency. I think we're happy to give you some stats that you might need. And so if you can be helpful to them, you can show value, then when they're hiring, they'll think of you. And so that would be like, to me, that would be the easiest like way to move into policy from a longer career in direct services.
Yeah, and then once you have that foot in the door with the policy field, say it's in homelessness or housing, then you can pivot to something like
Yeah.
DV or immigration or education, wherever else you'd want to pivot because you already have that policy experience.
Yep. Yeah.
Mhm.
And we all just trade at some point. Like I always just say we just like are all trading people all the time. Like you'll have a policy person over here who's been doing it for a while. They feel like they've like really excelled at it. And their adjacent agency or an agency that also does like the same thing. So say we're saying housing and it's DV, you know, if they have like a DV arm, then you can just like go over here and then end up in like the DV, doing that focus. And for those of you who've been doing clinical, like very intensive clinical work, there are so many opportunities in the behavioral health field for policy folks. And like you just kind of learn it. And so I know that sounds not helpful, but like I ended up becoming some weird expert in Medicaid policy, like from the policy perspective, because I had been in so many mental health coalitions. Um, so like there are so many behavioral health organizations that care about the work that you've done and are going to be able to utilize that to advance the cause. And so I know I just keep using housing because I was in housing, but mental health and behavioral health has umpteen million organizations that are doing advocacy and policy work that you could tap into easily.
Yeah, for that first transition point into
Yep,
policy from
exactly.
from where you are right now clinically.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then from there, if you want to pivot again, you can pivot your issue area. hmm That's
Hmm.
we want to do one pivot at a time, is what I always tell folks. So,
Yes, yes,
yeah.
that's such good advice. I totally agree with that.
All right. So I'd love to hear a little bit. I know you're just getting started with a consulting business now. You just moved to Michigan. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, what your day-to-day work looks like, and where you see yourself moving forward with your social work degree and background?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to talk about it. So, I started Recharge Strategy LLC about 2 years ago, because a lot of my coalition friends I had essentially done a strategy, facilitated a strategy session in my coalition. And they were like, "Hey, can you do that for my board?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so I had friends who were just requesting that I would facilitate their strategy sessions with their boards. And then a board member would be like, "Oh, I have another board. Can you help me with this one?" And I was like, "I should probably get paid for this because social workers should get paid for the work that they're doing." I am very big on that. And so I started Recharge Strategy and then knew that I wanted to go full time at some point. And then when my husband and I were making the move to Michigan, I decided this was a good time to, do all the new things at once and have no consistency and stability. It's really just the easiest way to do it. And so
Baptism by fire, right?
it
Like
really has
just
been. But the interesting thing is going into entrepreneurship. So I am not a nonprofit because, again, I believe I should be making money for the work that I'm doing. I predominantly work with nonprofits, as well as like individuals and like foundations, but I can work with nonprofits and have an impact with nonprofits without having to be a nonprofit myself. That is one thing I want people to take away. Everyone's like, "I'm going to start a nonprofit." I'm like, "Why? Don't we don't have to do that. It's a tax status. That's it." So anyway, so Recharge Strategy, what I do, like I said, is a lot of strategic planning. I do policy strategy specifically. And I think right now, the thing that's really valuable about that is with all of the executive orders and the actual policy changes that are coming down from the administration, it's sending everyone into an absolute tizzy, as it should. And people and organizations are getting distracted from what their mission and their actual like expertise is. And so, what I like to do with organizations is help them kind of recenter on what is their mission, what is their area of expertise so that they can add value where they add value instead of spreading their staff too thin, having to like learn about a whole bunch of issues that they don't really have that expertise in before they put out a statement in solidarity. And so, really trying to help folks do a full strategy. And I am a dork for a logic model. Like, talk about the social work skills that I use every day. Logic models. I could not stand them when I was in my MSW program, but I remember being at a conference one time and the person was presenting, and I couldn't understand what their goals were in this presentation. And so I ended up like writing them a logic model. And I was like, I'm not sure how that happened, but I do logic models with organizations so that they can actually measure their impact of their policy strategy and their advocacy work, which I think is really important to make sure people know where they're going and why are they doing this work, as well as training staff in some kind of everyday basics of like, how do you do relationship building? What does legislative research look like? How does one get to that first meeting where like I remember I was supposed to make appointments at one point in my internship. I think I delayed for like 3 weeks to make this appointment because I was so afraid. And then I realized it was like a 19-year-old answering the phone, and I should not be afraid of that because I was not much older, but really realizing that, like, again, politicians are people too, staffers are people. It's just an appointment. It's okay. And so, yeah, so I really got into this work, as I was going through the whole, like, what do you want to do? How do you niche down? What is your business strategy? Which, again, they don't teach us in MSW programs. They don't teach us business strategy. They don't teach us how to start a company, start a business, start an LLC. And that infuriates me because we're also telling people the only way you're going to make money is if you become a if you go into private practice. But we don't teach anybody how do you do that? Like, how do you actually be an entrepreneur in social work? So this is kind of like my latest rant of we need to be teaching people how to be entrepreneurs in social work. And so it's been really interesting because I've really dug into the entrepreneur community here in Southeast Michigan and Greater Detroit area. Um, so having to go to networking events a lot. I'm part of a mentorship program so that I could really figure out what are the steps to create a successful and sustainable business. Um, Having people to go to. I have a career coach, who is making sure that I understand like sales, which I don't. I have never had to do sales in my life. I could do budgeting really, really well. Um, I don't know how to do sales. So I'm learning all about sales pipelines. And someone the other day was like, "What's your CRM?" And I'm like, "Isn't that just for fundraisers? Like, don't we just use CRMs in fundraising?" And they were like, "Sabrina, do you think the nonprofit world really came up with CRMs?" And I was like, good point. It's actually a sales tool. Who knew? So, really having to learn a lot on the fly about being a business owner and what it takes to be able to turn those conversations that I have in those networking um, places that I go to into actual like paid clients. And so it's been a really interesting process. There's a social work entrepreneurs group that meets monthly. That I'm really, enjoying their company because they all want to just like toss the whole model on its head. And that's really nice. It's great to be around other social workers who aren't, and a lot of folks have a concern about like being in social work and making money. People have a lot of feelings about that. And my thing is, if the money exists out there, we should be able to make it, and we shouldn't feel bad about that because you can't bring other people up with you if you don't actually have power and capital.
All right. Before we wrap up here, I'd like to, a really important question I think I hear a lot is, for social workers who want to pivot outside of the more traditional social work roles, feeling like they need another degree. And it seems like you spoke quite a bit about this, other ways that you've gotten some of that business experience, but do you think it's necessary to go back to school for, say, like a business certificate or an MBA or something like that? Or are there other ways that folks can build these skills with just their MSW training? Is that
Oh yeah.
enough?
I always tell people, please do not go get another degree. There's zero reason to go get another degree. Again, it's not necessarily like what your degree is in, it's really the fact that you're able to finish a degree. Um, so there could be like if you are completely pivoting and you have no idea what you're doing, I think sometimes like a certificate's nice, but it's more because you need that training, not because anyone cares that you have the certificate. So, I've been thinking about this with coaching a lot, where I am doing coaching because I have been a leader in nonprofits for, you know, close to 15 years now. And so other people just ask if I can coach them, and I do. And so I do a lot of nonprofit leadership coaching, but I'm like, do I need this certificate yet? And I'm like, you know what? This will not be my main moneymaker. So no, I'm not going to spend thousands of dollars to get this training on something that like I already have an MSW. I've already been trained in like so many therapeutic um models that I just don't find it that valuable. But sure, get a cert like if you, I mean, there's so much free training. Just get the free training. Most of the time, no one cares if you have a certificate, depending on the thing, but like unless you're building, unless you want to go into like, website development and there's a specific training that would be helpful that folks who are looking for website developers look for, go for it. But for the most part, I actually don't, I find training very important. I don't find the certificates that valuable.
As you've pivoted to building your business in Michigan, I just had one more curious question about that. Are you sticking in the housing and homelessness space as you build your consulting work, or have you branched out to other areas of policy that might be related?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, so I'm doing a lot of disability policy right now as well. So I essentially cover all of human services. And so and it's like nonprofit, mostly nonprofits, like I said, but all of human services. So anything from child and family to um, what else am I working on? I am working on housing and homelessness, but also like economic development, poverty related programming. So anything really in that human services, economic development world is what I'm looking at. I don't do environmental, I don't do animals. And this is just like things that come up a lot where I'm like, I know nothing about environmental stuff and I don't feel like learning it right now. So it's not that I don't care about those things, it's that that's not my area of expertise. And I do find as a consultant, while I don't need to know everything about an area of expertise, it is helpful if I have context for the issue area. So, like healthcare, I also have a lot of context for. Yeah, for
So
sure.
thank you so much for sharing. I just want to end by hearing a little bit about if there's anything you'd like to share about what you love most about working in policy, or what's been most rewarding for you as you've built this more non-traditional social work path.
Yeah, the thing that I love about policy is that the impact you can have on like millions and millions of people. That is wild to me. And also, um, the thing that makes it the most rewarding. Um, at one point, I was able to like stave off some really terrible policies that would require people to recertify for benefits every other month. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And the being able to do that level of work and to really get people to understand um, the impact their policies are going to have on folks has been extremely rewarding. And being able to talk to a variety of people who have like very disparate belief systems than I do, um, and value systems than being able to talk to them in a way that brings us to a commonality that then can advance something for good is extremely valuable to me. And I love that part of my job.
Thank you so much for sharing. Where can people get in touch with you or find out more about your work if they're interested in learning more?
Sure. So LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and it's just Sabrina Gillan. And then my website is rechargestrategyllc.com. And that shows a lot of the things that I'm offering as services in this consultant role. And yeah, those are the two main ones. And then feel free, I'm always very open with my email, which is just Sabrina at rechargestrategyllc.com. I am always interested in having conversations with folks, so feel free to reach out and happy to, kind of work with folks. And if you want some coaching on what it's like to do this career thing, I am doing that actively. So happy to have conversations with people.
Awesome. Always great to find social workers in those roles that are willing to help others make the transition as well. So thank you so much, Sabrina Gillan, for sharing your journey and insights. And thank you to our viewers for being here. If you're a social worker thinking about expanding your impact beyond direct practice, we hope this conversation helps you to see what's possible. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Drop a note below to let us know what your biggest takeaway was from Sabrina's experience. And again, as I mentioned before, we are just getting started and we will have some other resources for you soon. So if you want to have support in pivoting to make systems level change with your social work career, sign up for my email list below, and we will see you next time.